Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Carter, and welcome to From Blueprint to Reality, how the scalable healthcare technology stack. I'm an enterprise architect at Mass General Brigham. Here's my LinkedIn information on this slide. I've been working in enterprise architecture for several years. I've been in healthcare for 15 plus years, and I've worked across, my experience spans from virtual care, digital health, marketing, contact centers, collaborating not just across Brigham and Women's and Mass General Hospital, but also the other 14 hospitals. Also, I do work with IEEE and have worked with various other healthcare systems, throughout my career. My hobbies include I'm a pianist. I'm also a martial artist in a karate style called Ouija-Ryu and an avid hiker. We're here to talk about how to bring an architectural blueprint to reality, um, from architectural vision to execution. And what does that really mean? And to do that, I really want to start by looking at architectural challenges. And I'm going to talk about four of them, and I think are probably the most prevalent for folks working in this space. And that will lead to, well, how do you address those challenges? And that's going to be through a framework I'm going to walk through. And I'll wrap up the presentation going through that framework in some detail using some real life examples, specifically talking through my journey and a project that we've had recently called digital channels and digital channel delivery. This talk is going to be helpful for those who are actually working in architecture, whether you're a technology vendor, whether you're a technologist at a healthcare system or an executive. It'll give you basically the perspective of what it takes to build out the architecture, both from the beginning to end. And often there's this misconception that it's one or two technologies, happening behind the scenes when the truth is it's a myriad of technologies that you need to deliver an experience at the end of the day. So with that, let's get started. Let's talk about those challenges I mentioned. And there's four of them. The first is the pace of change. And this is an observation that I've had working in healthcare, often specifically within healthcare, because the demand from our patients is increasing every day, and it is very difficult for many healthcare systems to keep up. Due to that fact, we have a lot of stagnation in sort of technological improvements and innovation. And that's important because that includes things that need to get addressed, right? Vital integrations, vital improvements that need to happen, and that impedes efficiency. Now, the other side of that, how to solution around that certainly is a more complex talk than what I can have today. But what I can say is that having an architectural vision documented, something you can point to and sort of socialize with your peers, your leadership, that is going to get you there to a point where you can now say either we're behind or falling behind, or hey, guess what? We're ahead of either market or where we want it to be. So having that vision, and that's part of the framework, will be super important. The second sort of challenge that I think a lot of healthcare systems struggle with is security and compliance. And that's both because they're evolving threats. But we are a regulated industry, and so we need to keep up with protection of that sensitive data across whether you're domestically in the US or working internationally. By addressing this from a solution standpoint, from principles and through sort of a platform first perspective, you can get partially there, right? And I would say even more than partially. That means you're building off the security frameworks you already have in place for many of your larger, platforms. That also boils down to integration services as well. So how you integrate with other applications or services, building off the securities that have already been defined there are going to be super important to staying, secure and compliant. And I'll talk about how that sort of boils down into a framework in a little bit. Third challenge, platform versus point solutions. This is one of those challenges that I hear reoccurringly, through my work, and that is, somebody very, very knowledgeable is looking to implement a technology that they've been grown attached to because it solved a problem for them. Um, and then we have this platform sort of approach that I just mentioned. And how do you bridge that gap, right? It's a point solution versus the platform. And we could probably deliver probably 80% of what they need through a platform, but there's still that last 20%. And so what we need to do is within this framework, have space to integrate sort of the best of breed with a scalable platform. And so that there is a way to bridge that gap, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Lastly, the cone of uncertainty, challenge number 4, and I'm stealing this phrase from a former boss of mine, but the fact being that the further you look out, the larger that cone of uncertainty starts to expand. You're not quite sure what is going to be coming down the pike at you, 2, 3 years from now. But you need to have some sort of plan in place. Otherwise, budgeting, resourcing, all of that becomes very difficult. So the idea here is that we have to build a model, work from a framework, but that there needs to be iterations embedded and fused in that so we can make the proper adjustments. And I'm not going to be talking about agile today. This is just talking about iteration. So that is sort of the problems and challenges and sort of the appropriate solutions that I think we're going to frame the rest of this conversation. And I hope you agree. So let's talk about that framework a little bit more. So the architecture framework I'm going to walk through is both an extension of enterprise architecture, but also, just an observation and the feed, something I've learned through, my time as an enterprise architect. The digital channels example is something I'm trying to do to bring some life to this so that you're seeing real life examples and sort of how this takes shape. There's 4 phases, if you haven't noticed, discovery, design, delivery, service, and support. Now, underneath that is sort of the meat, right? So if we're going to perform some discovery, what are we really trying to do? We're trying to connect the business problem with a solution. And ultimately, that's going to end up being architecture. But the first thing to do is to define that problem. And I'm going to go into detail of how we do that, at least from an architectural standpoint. The next step there is determining your reference architecture, or really trying to build a solution with technology on what you know. And so it's building that inventory, building a catalog, and then that helps sort of trigger the next step, which is going to be the work to be done. And a lot of times that work to be done is assessments. You need to assess other technologies, perform architectural reviews, things of that nature to get to some of the technology targets that you may not have. And I'll go into more detail in a moment there. Next is a specification. Now, this is the next level of detail. And ultimately, it's the detail needed for people to provide security guidance, compliance guidance, but also to actually build the thing. Whether it's you're doing it internally or looking to another vendor, this is a critical point because you're really validating some of your assumptions that you've made prior. I'll go into more detail in just a moment. Lastly, the delivery and execution. And this is about now the services that you want to extend to your customers, whether it be patients or your own, enterprise staff, etc. But those services are going to be key, identifying them and then also building for criticality. Depending on what level of criticality you need, we'll go into more detail and sort of how that flushes out, in the framework as we go. Now on this slide, you'll see there's deliverables, artifacts under each one of these. I'm going to give examples and sort of show you what I've done. They're sort of generified because there are a lot of confidential items, in the real documents, but hopefully you can appreciate that. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me either through LinkedIn or through the conference. So first item, defining the problem. This is about leveraging design principles in my mind. What you're trying to do is you're trying to identify what are your pains, your gains, right? To quote the late great Clay Christensen, you're trying to define those problems from a user perspective, along with the data to support that. This is super important. I think a lot of healthcare systems or smaller programs, they forget this step. They forget to truly define what the problem is, and therefore they end up with a solution that doesn't quite match. And so this is important, and it's important to spend some time here. Now, once you define that problem, you're generating ideas. You're working across stakeholders. You're working across peers and different teams, trying to make sure, like, all right, let's. What are some ideas? What are some solutions that could work? And once you have those solutions to those potential challenges, you can now think about recommendations. And I would talk to like creating recommendations that are void of technology first. You're trying to identify what is the business capability that I need to enable through technology. That is super important. Once you have that, you want to document it. And this is bolded because a lot of folks, they go through this step and they spend a lot of time here. They forget to document it. So the historical sort of record, it gets lost. But the idea here is document it in a white paper, document it in a presentation, and then socialize. And this is so important because with an enterprise architecture, many people feel we live in an ivory tower, and that's hopefully not the case. I'm really trying to address that here. It's socialization through the whole process to make sure, no one's being brought into a project or an initiative or a decision blindly. Now, on the right here, you have a white paper that I wrote. It's unfortunately internal. I cannot distribute it, but the idea is the same. I took these concepts of like, okay, we have a digital front door is, that's sort of an industry term problem where we're trying to engage our patients digitally and it's sort of out of whack. We have a lot of patients calling us versus, being able to self-service and or being treated, through other channels. So that is really the crux of what I built my business proposition around and why I think we need to move to, a more expanded digital interaction at MGB. So with that, you're going to take the concepts here. You're going to take these challenges, these business capabilities, and bring that into the next level and the next step, which is the reference architecture. Once you've identified these core business capabilities, you begin mapping what you know around the vendors that you have in your stack, to those capabilities. Okay, which vendors can actually cover this for us? And is that really where we want to be, or is that they sort of do it, but not, really? So that this is an important step because this is going to lead to the work to be done. So the idea is you map to these business capabilities. As you're going, you're identifying gaps. You're also identifying areas of consolidation. Let's say you have several vendors in one of these capability boxes. Well, do you need them all? Most likely not. That also probably represents some sort of cost savings. So it's important to identify those as work to be done. Now you'll see some vendors are covering more than one box here, and that's actually super important as well because those become your strategic partners, and those are the folks you want to spend some time with, talking about partnerships, co-dev, etc., because that's really where you're going to see the biggest bang for your buck. And then lastly, this analysis begins to inform your implementation strategy. You may not be able to do this all in 1 year or in 6 months. So now you're starting to build out what will become a multi-year strategy. So that leads to more work. Unfortunately, you're going to have to do some assessments. You're going to have to assess some vendors or some technology or whether you want to build this internally. And those assessments come sort of in three flavors. Architectural review, which is probably the biggest lift out of them all because it's not necessarily one technology. You're probably assessing several technologies to fulfill a business capability, along with all their integrations, the data management, all of that stuff. It's all part of it. And you're going to market, you're talking to peers. This is a pretty big, lift here. Then the market scans, you may be looking at some comparable vendors, very, maybe not highly differentiated, but you need to understand sort of what the market's bearing, where is it going. So it's sort of less of a lift than an architectural review, but there is work to be done. And then lastly, a vendor scan where you have very comparable vendors. They may actually all be in your institution already, and you're really trying to determine which is the right horse, if you will, to choose and to go with. Now, this assessment leads to both a short-term and long-term strategy. So what you choose in the beginning may not be where you go long-term, and that's okay. That's part of the process and part of the journey. The other stumbling block I think a lot of systems fall into, accidentally, of course, is the fact that they're trying to assign this to one person or one resource. These assessments should be a team activity, at least a few folks. You're getting more than one perspective, and that will give you a better quality result, in my opinion. Looking at architects, you're looking at analysts, and you're looking at subject matter experts for sure to try to make these determinations. Having a tool is super important to streamline efficiency with this work. So if you're trying to use Excel, things of that nature, that's okay. You can certainly do it. But the more you have to collaborate, the harder those tools become, as you go. So having something, I'm a big fan of the Gartner Buy Smart tools specifically that help just better uh, it adds efficiency into being able to the workflow and all the different steps in the process, and then you have a sort of a central place where all the assessments can be stored. So it's very nice. But that's just an example. There's others out there in the market for sure. And then lastly, document the decisions. The decisions, if they're not documented, I find that they're not really decisions because then they can be questioned. But this is also another opportunity to once those decisions are made and documented, you socialize. You send that out to your leaders, and that gives them the opportunity to question and things of that nature. But you have the opportunity to also put it to bed. And then there's sort of a phase gate there that, okay, we're ready to move forward. We have this piece and it's been documented. This is an example of a summary assessment that I've done specifically for digital channels. This is a particular one for conversational AI. I've sort of, taken out all the real big specifics because I unfortunately can't share that here. But the idea is that you have your sort of functional requirements being covered. There's some sort of scoring happening. However, the decision is not made on scoring alone. As you can see, you have costs, strengths, areas of improvements, company background, all of that plays into decision making and should be brought to the surface when you're making it. So it's not just on requirements and scoring. Those are basically inputs at the end of the day. So once you have your assessments done, once you've chosen your vendors, you've documented, you've socialized, you're now going to the next level. It's time to talk turkey, most likely with one or several particular vendors to build out the design and validate, honestly, your initial recommendations. Now, this is where you start to embed the needs for contracting, your needs for security, compliance, and build. They should be infused in this design. So you need all those details sort of built into the specifications. So when you go to contracting, you have a sense of scope and you're having that conversation with the vendor directly, and it's in the contract. That's also super important. Now, after that, you have your design assumptions. There may be certain aspects of this you need to prototype, you need to pilot, and that's okay. And that's where you begin, your partnerships with your vendors and your different stakeholders. You start building out those prototypes and pilots to ensure that you have data to back up the basically the technical designs that we're putting in place here. And if there are areas that are just sort of fuzzy, design sessions, but it's just the best way to go. You're building for target, right? So not what you can do in 3 months, 6 months. You're building what you want the end state to be. So it's important in these specifications to identify that and to flush that out. It's all right to identify things that aren't ready and when they will be ready, because that's what then becomes the phasing opportunities that you'll find, when you start looking at your implementation strategy and really start to put some meat in the bones there and get to a little more specificity, a little more detail. And then most importantly, and this is what helps inform ITSM and service delivery later on, this is where you begin documenting your SLAs. Okay, how important to the application or the business capability is this system? If it were to go down, what do I do? Who would need to be informed? How often do I need it to be up? What type of disaster recovery do I need in place? This is the type of thing you want to go into prior to contracting so that you have the service level that you can offer to your enterprise documented in the design versus, later in a contract. And then lastly, socialization, right? This coming back to it. This is so important to make sure your ideas and the design is not a surprise to stakeholders, other teams. You're talking about this far ahead of time before the ink is on the paper. So that way, everybody can give their input. You can filter through that input, obviously, but the idea is that the final document will be inclusive of all that is important for that, contracting, the security, compliance, and build phases. And so then that leads us to sort of delivery and execution. This is an important phase. Obviously, this is where, the rubber sort of meets the road, as they say. And the idea here is to understand business criticality, as I sort of mentioned before. how important is this capability to the mission? Is this something that could go down and nobody would notice and you have plenty of time to sort of stand it back up? Or is this something, if it goes down, care delivery stops for a moment. And that's obviously the criticality pieces that we want to make sure we're getting ahead of. So the idea here is understand what criticality this is so that you can build that criticality, whether it be through business continuity, disaster recovery, through sort of data recovery, all of those recovery words that people like to throw out there, that you have that built into design throughout, so that way you're making sure that's not in one component, not the other. This is important, and it's also important to partner with your business partners in the overall, business stakeholders around this planning too, so that they have visibility and a say of, okay, how are the communications work? What is our backup plan? And what is needed from a technology standpoint, is from a recovery standpoint. Like, what do we need to recover? Is there data loss, capacity, or is there none? And then we have to plan for that. You're reinforcing the architectural vision here, as you go into these specifications within standard service and ITSM, which is IT, service management. The idea is that this is where you're baking all into the contracting process, into your operating model, but then also continuous improvement. I mean, you're not just going to implement a platform and it's done. Typically, you implement the platform and now there's a process of further releases, new functionality. Like, how does that all happen? Getting feedback from your users and whether it be patients or care teams, etc. So the idea here is that you want to make sure that you have these processes mapped out and documented, coming back to my theme there, so that it is in place before you go live. That is super important. A lot of, hospitals, or other health systems, I would say, sometimes it's more important to get that technology out there. It feels that way, but then when you don't have the process in place, certain things start bubbling up, right? So highly recommend, having this in place, prior to your go lives, but also making sure that, everybody's aware. Hence the next step: document, socialize, stakeholders, teams, etc. And having an artifact in their hands that they can hold and point to is super important. And so I like to just point out, so to the right here, this is the artifact that I use. It's a Word document. Doesn't necessarily be, we can bake this into different, knowledge management and service management tools. But the idea here, it's being stored somewhere centrally, whether it be in your service management or your policies infrastructure. The idea is that there's a central place. So when something happens down the road, you have a central place to pull documentation from. So ultimately, this is a package deal. The framework is probably not that foreign to many if you understand, different, project frameworks that are out there. However, bringing it together from an architectural perspective is important. I think that's a different discipline than most organizations are used to. And that's okay. I think modern software companies, they're probably very familiar with this enterprise architecture framework, but that's why I'm sharing it today. I want to sort of get the word out to other health systems. It's a good way to work, and it's a good discipline to try to embed within your organization, and you'll see the benefits both in, lowering costs, decreasing your architectural footprint, but also better services that are more experience led. They're more designed around experiences. So with that, I'm going to end today. Feel free to contact me either through LinkedIn, through the conference, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you.